Hey there, this is author illustrator Jarrett Lerner, the creator of A Work in Progress. I am here today to make the first of several videos I'll be making to go along with the global read aloud of A Work in Progress. This video will cover the first week of reading, which is pages 1 through 48. I'm making these videos not to provide a summary of what happens in the book, but to give some hopefully interesting insight and information into the creation of the book from me, the creator. So there's a few things about this first chunk of the book that I thought it might be fun and interesting and useful to share. The first is just about the creation of this book and sort of the story before this book became a book. A lot of times at school visits, I get asked how long books take to make or how long a certain book takes to make. This book is without a doubt and might always be the book that did take me and has taken me the longest to make. This story, the story that ultimately became A Work in Progress and Will's, is one that I started to write or try to write when I was in college. And that was over a decade ago now. I always wanted to write a story about a kid like Will who felt uncomfortable in his body, uncertain of who he was and how to be, who felt sort of at odds with himself, because that's an experience that I had when I was a kid. And I'll get more deep into that in a moment. But every time I tried to write this story, it never came out in a way that I felt was authentic and true and complete and right. I tried everything. Every 6 months, every year, I would pick it back up and try again. I would try to come at it from a different angle, a different perspective. I would change the tense. I wrote in past tense and then present tense and then future tense. I wrote it as a first person narrative, then as a third person. I think I even tried a second person narrative once. I tried to write it from multiple perspectives, all sorts of things. And it wasn't until probably on my 10th, 11th, 12th try, now over 10, 15 years of trying and failing, that I finally landed on the idea of telling the story as it is now, in verse. And I landed on this idea because, first of all, I'd tried everything else. And second of all, and maybe more importantly, it turned out, was when I was a kid, like Will's age, and going through the sort of things that Will goes through in this book, I kept a notebook, lots of them. And this is what my notebooks looked like. A mix of words and drawings and doodles and scribbles. And I didn't write often in complete sentence. I didn't know what this was called, verse, free verse. I didn't know that this was a form of poetry. I just naturally found it. It felt right. Often when you sit down at a blank piece of paper, it can be really difficult to, whether you're trying to write fiction or just get your thoughts and feelings out, it can be really difficult to put those things into full, complete, proper sentences. And I discovered that I could just dump things out of me, not worrying about the sentence structure, if it was a sentence, if it was a fragment, if it made any sense to anyone else besides me. Because these notebooks of mine that I kept, they were just for me. They were a place to pour my thoughts and feelings, to explore things both verbally and visually. I've always been a doodler. I've always been an artist. I was always drawing. And so that's what these notebooks were. And I finally landed on this idea to tell the story as if I was inviting you into Will's private notebook. He's telling this story incidentally. He's telling this story for his own sake, to figure things out. That's how I used my notebook, and that's how Will is using these notebooks. So it was when I landed on this particular form that things really began to take off for me, that the writing started to go right in a way that it hadn't all those other attempts and over all of those years. The other thing that's important to talk about, and the other thing that really made this story finally come to pass and come to fruition in a way that felt complete and authentic and right, was that I started allowing myself to be more personal. So this story and all the iterations of it that came before, it was always a fictionalization of my own experiences. But I was still working through a lot of what I went through, a lot of the issues that Will has. I still am in many ways. And I don't think I was healthy enough. I don't think I had enough perspective yet to tell the story in a way that it was beneficial and useful for other people to read. But I also wasn't brave enough yet to sort of delve into my own past and put it into a book through the lens of fiction in a really true and honest way. And the thing that really unlocked that for me was starting the whole book with a flashback. The book begins with Will in 4th grade, but most of the book and the place from which Will is telling the story is Will in 7th grade. So it's 3 years later. But one day I sat down and I relived a memory nearly identical to the one that Will experiences at the very beginning of the book. In 4th grade, Will is walking down a hallway in school, minding his business, and a kid stops him out of nowhere, seemingly, and basically humiliates him publicly. Makes him feel terrible about his body, which launches a sort of insecurity that snowballs like a snowball rolling downhill, getting bigger and bigger and faster and more intense. And it basically starts Will on this journey that covers a work in progress. But once I allowed myself to sort of delve into my own memory of a situation I experienced in 4th grade, very much like that, once I put in the work, and it was a lot of work, to find the words and phrasing and pictures to make that experience feel just right, just like the way that I hope it feels to you empathetically when you're reading the book. Once I did that, once I was brave enough, sort of the story began to take shape and it started to feel more right and authentic and true. So it took me probably a dozen years of trying and failing and trying again, which is a theme of the whole book, to find the form, which is the presentation of the material, and also the content, to be brave enough to actually delve into the content in the way that I needed to before I really figured out this book. And once I figured all that stuff out, it was still about 3 years of work before the book was finally declared finished. And I was working on this book, tweaking words here and there and illustrations here and there, pretty much until my editor and art director said, okay, we are literally sending the files to the printer right now. You can stop sending us edits. This book is called a work in progress, and that's a theme throughout it, but it was a work in progress up until the last moment. And I have actually found myself continuing to work on this book, even though it's done. It's been printed now for, as of the making of this video, it's been out for 4 months, and it went to press and started printing 9 months ago. But when I read this book aloud in classrooms and libraries and at conferences, I often find myself continuing to edit it. I'll change words, change things. So I'm still working on this book. The other thing about the beginning of this book, the first 48 pages that I wanted to sort of draw your attention to is the illustrations. Illustrations and the drawing are very important for the book and for Will, and I hope for the reading experience. And they start pretty much right away. There's all of these motifs that you'll start seeing in the book, never mind my notes. But here you see the outline of Will's face, a disembodied face, an outline of a face with this scribble knot that will start appearing more and more throughout the book. So already you're seeing a few things. Hopefully you're seeing Will working on drawings, and by extension, sort of figuratively, visually working on himself. And he's disembodied. He's not connected to his body. And often when he thinks of his body and the way he looks, there's this angry scribble sort of covering him. This continues right away. We have a scribble knot. By the way, I'll probably be saying that a lot when I talk about the drawings, but scribble knot is the term that my art director and I began to use for these sort of tangles and scribbles, and that relates to a poem that's in this section, which he talks about things getting tangled, the line of your life getting tangled. But this sort of goes throughout, this idea of Will sort of exploring shapes, the shape of his body and his face, trying to make sense of things. There's a lot of disembodied bodies, because bodies are something that Will is very much focusing on. Bodies and also words. The words that people are saying, which form a large part of the visuals. And I don't want to tell you how to interpret the drawings, because that would sort of spoil much of the fun. But a few things just to point out are, in addition to some of the more obvious or hopefully evocative things that I want to leave up to you for your own interpretation, there's a few things that start to get sort of picked up as we move through this. The scribble knots, which will start getting larger and more intense. And up here, you'll see that there's the first of many sort of skulls. Skulls become a sort of motif for him as sort of these angry looks. Grins and frowns. Here's the poem about scribble knots. And then sort of some of these shapes that he's drawing begin to focus, begin to get more cohesive. And this is an important illustration for the book, because it's Will turning into visually this monster that the way he thinks of himself. Will experiences and has something in this book called body dysmorphia. So basically, when he looks at himself, when he thinks of himself, he doesn't see himself. He sees an exaggerated, in a very negative way, version of himself. He sees this monster. And this idea really begins to take shape as we leave Will behind in 4th grade and enter the present, enter 7th grade. So at the very end of this section, we see Will compared to everyone else, and this is how he feels when he's around other people. And it's at the very end of this section that we rejoin Will, and we start seeing him around other people. First, a former friend of his at a store, and then finally Jules, this girl who he has begun to develop feelings for. And I hope as you go through the book, you're paying close attention, of course, to the language and how the language is presented. But I hope you're also looking carefully at the drawings, and at which drawings are gray, to be like a sketch-like, more loose, unformed thought. What drawings begin to be drawn sort of in an inkier black, more defined sort of version, which have been carefully colored in by Will, and sort of what other miscellaneous things are appearing. But As you move throughout the book, there's a bird. Birds are going to pop up more, along with monsters and these monstrous teeth in mouths. As you move through the book, some of the initial ideas presented here in the illustrations are really going to be developed in ways that I hope make meaning as powerfully and evocatively and richly as do the words and the development of the language used and how it's presented. So that's a bit of behind the scenes information and insight into the first chunk of a work in progress. If you are doing the Global Read Aloud and reading this book, I hope you're enjoying it and it's leading to a lot of great discussions and private personal thinking. And also hope you'll tune in to these videos and that they'll offer you an extra layer of insight and meaning and enjoyment into the book. Thank you so much.